What I'm going to do is, the whole presentation, there are two parts to my presentation. One part, I've already circulated you some reading list, which is specifically on the issue of Shillong, which recently happened. And many of us who are, interested in the context, the conflicts, I thought that would be an interesting reading, and then we can discuss. But I think many times what happens, if you don't know what is happening to the overall urbanization process in the Northeast, then basically I think, we would be out of context. So what I thought was, given my limited knowledge on the Northeast urbanization process, I still would like to give you a profile of what is happening, overall urbanization dynamics processes. In this presentation, there are three, groups of slides that I would like to show. One, which basically talks about overall context of urbanization, what it is, and why it is relevant. Maybe little bit of course, we can't discuss given a limited time, but what are the theoretical approaches of looking at urban issues, urban planning, which is becoming relevant. That is one part. Then the interesting part, which I, in the sense that based on my working experience in different cities, I have evolved a framework, which I think is important for us to understand before we analyze cities, right? And Northeast has a very specific context. And I will also talk about a little bit of how urbanization is taking place in Northeast, the 7 sisters, and maybe talk about planning. Of course, again, it is a big thing, so discussing, but I would like to, generalize. Now, there are two things. Why urbanization? Of course, everybody thinks that we need to urbanize to become modern, but there is more economic reason behind that, because most of the, empirical evidences show that once you urbanize, your GDP becomes higher, per capita income increases, so, economically we do well. And that is one of the reasons, that's why, and historically, if you see across all over the world, per capita income and urbanization has more or less, gone together. And that is one of the reasons why we say that urbanization is important. But the most important question is, why Northeast? Now, Northeast, most of the time we tend to generalize and homogenize as one unit. I don't believe in that. Though I am talking about Northeast, I think the problem with that will be too generalization, but even in this particular thing we cannot do much beyond that. First of all, Northeast is as diverse as it could be. Both, not only culturally, there are different cultural regions in this particular part of the country, but also environmentally it is so very diverse, And when we try to understand urbanization, if you don't put urban centers in the context of environment and the cultural regions, then your analytical framework becomes very weak. That is one of the reasons why many of the policies of the government of India, it doesn't work here. The planning norms and strategies, when we have a urban planning norms, most of the norms are evolved by the town planning departments, the Ministry of Urban Development sitting in Delhi, by some big consultants like McKinsey and others. And when they come to this area, they are not aware how it is implemented, because it doesn't internalize the realities, both cultural, environmental, and more importantly, the issues of property rights, land rights, land management. Urban planning is at the end of the day basically about land. So if you don't understand land, if you try to use some of those British, acts and, what we think at the mainland, those are the challenges. So therefore, what I'm trying to say is that, of course, those are issues, but another thing is that, Northeast, many a times we have this idea Northeast is very less urbanized. Yes, statistically, yes. But if you look at it the way of life, the urbanism as a way of life, I think Northeast is much more urbanized than many other parts of this country. So there is basically, Northeast provides us a challenge to, provides us an opportunity to contest the idea of how you define urban. But whatever said and done, because Northeast has a low urban base, in future is certainly going to urbanize. So therefore, I believe the urban challenges are going to be much more important. And when I say urban challenges, it is not only about planning land use and building construction, providing amenities like water, infrastructure, but the most important urban planning issues will be the conflicts, mainly related to institutions, laws and regulations. Therefore, the relevance of Northeast. And therefore, we need to debate this. Maybe we need to generate specific policies. We have Northeastern Council here, but there are no schools of planning, or I don't know, there are architecture schools, but I don't know how much they are embedded in the realities of Northeastern, vernacular building styles and planning strategies. We don't know about that, right? So therefore, the relevance of the Northeast. Therefore, we need, and therefore, it is wonderful. That's why I come here, because you have initiated this dialogue, and there are, I think we need to take this up and really understand why this urban challenge is going to be important. In the context of urbanization, yes, there are positive externalities. It does benefit in terms of economic growth, development. We may call it that it also allows us to think progressively in terms of arts, culture, aesthetics, whatever. So there are the good points of urbanization. Everybody likes to be in urban. So there are aspirational issues, all those modernization issues are there. That is a positive thing. But there are negative externalities, which are very, very important. One, there are social, economic, spatial costs of inequality, exclusion, conflicts in land use, which creates a lot of problems in the cities, right? But one of the most interesting thing and very relevant in the context of North is the environmental cost. Environmental cost, because the terrain and the environment itself is so sensitive. It is also earthquake prone zone area, I think zone 5, and of course we all know that because the drainage density is so high, the rainfall is so high, the flooding is a major issue, and many parts of the hill areas of this area are very vulnerable to landslides. So you can imagine if you don't plan urban areas properly, whatever planning means, it is again a contested idea, but that is the thing. There are different ways to urban theory, urban planning. There are different schools of thought. Mostly they are Western schools of thought, bringing the human ecology, Chicago school, which is known. But I think the Marxists, David Harvey and others are talking about, and that is also relating to the subaltern school, which talks about many of these right-based issues in cities. How do you internalize those in the planning process? And then, of course, these days everybody talks as city as a corporate entity, city as an entrepreneurial center, a city as a company, or which is basically intended to make money. And that is basically also the globalization discourse, and that is when most of the countries want to make their cities as global, because that is the narrative. I don't know what it is meant by global, but every city, wants to be global city, right? And that is why we have a lot of architecture, smart city is a classic example of, that perverted notion of global city. But the most important thing, and it is related to the second part of that articles, I think the issue of who has the right to the city. And these whole questions of urban citizenship, entitlements, rights, justice, I think these are issues which is becoming very, very important, not only for general discussion, but also in urban planning, which is actually a subject which is oriented to implementing things at the field. So how do you internalize this? Now I'll just give you an example, China has already reached 51% urban, right? But what is interesting is, in Chinese case, they control migration by a policy called hukou. You are not supposed to migrate, because if you are registered in a village, unless the state allows you, you cannot go, and if you go to a city, your entitles are not given. That is how they control mobilities, right? But in India, that is not true. The constitution allows us to move from one place to another, make our living. But the point is, despite the constitution allowing those people to move from one place to another, do they make a decent living, right? Do the cities provide them opportunities besides livelihood and other things? So I think these are very, very important issues. So I think we need to keep it in our mind. If you want to really understand a city, you need to understand the environment. Technology is very, very important. Any city, wherever you go, actually technology has played a very important role. It need not be smart technology. It may be a very basic indigenous technology like irrigation canal or whatever it may be. But technology changes the way things happen, right? Social structure, how the community, the system, the whole is organized. What is the, relationship between the people, those who produce and those who consume, who controls power. I think power is the most important thing. Therefore, to understand the locus of power in the whole social structure system is very, very important. And the power shifts. Power shifts over a period of time. Power also sometimes changes spatially, right? And therefore, the relationship between the power and space, we need to understand that. Ideology, and lastly the institution. I think this is one of the most important things. Institutions, normally we tend to categorize institutions as formal and informal, right? Formal are those which are statutory in nature, written down. Informal are those which is maybe because of practices, norms, traditions and all that. But, wherever we go, the whole governance failure is basically because the institutions have not evolved, or some aspect of institutions contradicts the another aspect of the same institution or somebody other institution. In the context of Northeast, this is vital. Herein you will see, playing out of the colonial rules and regulations, the indigenous institutional norms, and the post-colonial, the post-independence period acts which are into play in this particular part of the country. And all of you know that there are different rules for the hills, different rules for the plains. It is very interesting in Assam, even the tribes are considered as plain tribes and the hill tribes. I am not saying that is the right way to do, but what I am saying that look at the way, there is a tendency to classify different communities, So therefore, these are very, very important things. And if, of course, one can develop this, but if you understand this, and if you understand this, how these things are changing over a period of time, I think then you will understand a city and an urban area. If you only look at one aspect, then I don't think you will understand the city, because cities are complex, interrelated entities. One change in one leads to change in the other. Of course, that is true for all, but because population is concentrated in such a small area, and a lot of interaction takes place, this becomes very important. Yes, this is please, I would like you to, maybe you can contribute, if you want to what I have realized is in the Northeast, again I said this will vary depending, because Northeast is not homogeneous entity, there are diversities, different states, different, but my general understanding and overall, if I have to generalize, suppose what are the important things that has impacted, if you want to understand urban areas or urbanization process, one is the pre-colonial or spaces, if at all it was there. I think the history of colonial, intervention in this part begins only around 1800s. Before that, certainly there were people, there were civilization, there were, communities which are living there. So what it was like before? We need to understand that. The other important thing then comes the colonial period, the colonial institution which was created, right? Right from district administrations to municipal corporation. We also have a very nice, the Britishers were very smart people, that is one thing I have realized. One of the most important things they gave, importance to was institution. If you go to Nagaland, the traditional, the village headman, they very nicely co-opted the village headman with the district administration system. You see, they did that because the district, he was known as a collector, his job was to collect revenue. If he creates conflict with the people's representative, then how will he collect the revenue? So what he did was, okay, the old man, the village headman, or the whosoever it may be, will be given as much respect and honor as a district collector, but the strategy that will facilitate revenue collection and the circulation process, right? So therefore, these are examples, but it happens all over India in different. So they created an institution, they had a co-opting mechanism of institutions, but they also created other institutional norms. So we need to understand what are the types of colonial institutions that were created, and of course in India many of the institutional mechanisms that they created, we are still following it. The other thing about the investment. Now there are two types of investment one can think of. Investments, say for instance in tea plantation, right, because that was a major capital investment, very, very enclave type of investment. And the other one is about the infrastructure, road, railways. If you map those, you will try and you will get some picture of the nature and pattern of urbanization evolving, and along with each of them, again, different type of institutions have evolved. Trade. Now, trade, there are two types of trade. One is trans-frontier trade, like Manipur used to have, or say Gangtok used to have with China, that was a major trade route. Maybe Arunachal used to have. So, the trans-frontier trade route, in fact, I was reading a very interesting theory. Just below Bhutan, there is an area called Duars, and I believe that there are a lot of transactions taking place along those particular areas, right. So, so therefore, trans-frontier trade is very, very important. Like if you look into the growth of some of the, trading towns like, Gangtok or Kalimpong before 60s and after 60s, you will see they are not growing, and that was because the trade had stopped. I am sure that must be the same story in Manipur or other parts of it. But the other important thing is internal trade within the region. I think that is also we need to understand. Many of the urban centers in India, in Northeast, are basically known for educational centers, and the missionaries played a very important role in promoting education. So, if you look into the economic base of many urban settlements in India, education is one of the most important. So, again I feel that because education, why it is important? It is not only important because of establishment of a school, but it is important because it created a human resource base which may be very different from other parts of the country. The other important thing is partition and migration, right. I think that we can understand, like say for instance boundaries. Of course, this part of the country was always known as a frontier, but boundaries have played a very important role. When you create boundaries, you create a lot of problem. Like if you think about say Guwahati or maybe any other riverine settlement along the Brahmaputra, if you analyze, if you read the British economic history, and if you read the analysis how trade used to happen along the Brahmaputra, many of the urban centers was quite flourishing. Once Pakistan was East Pakistan came up, the boundaries became restrictive, the importance of many of the urban centers declined, right. So, therefore, partition is not only about like creating stoppage of movement of people, it is also about trade and other things. So, therefore, we need to understand that. War, okay, that is important. Another important thing is the state reorganization. About Northeast, now we have many states, but previously there were hardly any. And what is important is every time you reorganize the state, a new locus of power comes up spatially. So, they act as some sort of a primate city within that political boundary of that state. So, therefore, this is the state reorganization and what are the implications are very important, but they also are barriers. Like that was the reason why Northeastern Council was created. Northeastern Council was basically created so that investment decisions can be taken in a coordinated manner. The boundaries don't act as a barrier. Like many of the projects were supposed to be interstate type, but I don't know how effective is the Northeastern Council, but this is one thing which we need to state. The other important thing, movements. When I say movements, I mean the movements for political identity movements, like say for instance, Assam had a long movement, many states, many of the northeastern states actually suffer from these issues. And it is very, very important because when such movements takes place, governance becomes weak. When governance becomes weak, the economic base becomes weak and people tend to migrate to some few centers within the region. So, that is the story of how Guwahati has become a primate city, right, because it still provided some opportunities, so everybody moved in there. But that is true for other areas, like say for instance, if you talk about Gangtok, many a times the growth of Gangtok is also related to the movements in Darjeeling for the Gorkhaland movement, right. People moved there because there are more opportunities. I will give you the statistics, what happens, of the differences. So, understanding movements and its implication in the cities is very, very important. And lastly, development planning, the planning that we prepare, the policies that we prepare, both at the center and the state has implications. Suppose if the state is talking about GNNUR. So, I think this is just a limited way, but what I am trying to say is that these are very, very important things that has taken place in Northeast, and if you don't take into account to understand urbanization processes in this place, it will be very, very difficult for us to understand. It may be much more elaborated, and I've just written how these things impact, the land use, institutions, the networks. Networks are very important, because if you are talking about settlement system never grows in an isolated manner. Settlement systems grow in a networks. Networks to a large extent depends upon the mobility of goods, services and people, right? And therefore the importance of understanding this. So this is a framework which I have evolved. People may agree, disagree, but I am pretty convinced that if I use this, it helps me much better than picking up a rights issue and then discussing. If you don't link it up with other issues, it becomes very, very okay, but not the true picture of the situation, especially because this is a very complex place. Now let's go to the hard facts. I'm just giving you some examples from statistics based on 2011 census. If you see this, I think most of the northeastern states, like Assam is the one state which has a large number, but other are small states, so the number of urban areas are less. But if you look into the urbanization, most of the states have lower urbanization than the average India, except for Mizoram, and this one is Manipur. Mizoram is very interesting, because of the high level of urbanization, which is substantial, but most of these accounts for by Aizawl, right? And so is true with Sikkim. Basically much less, and growth rates are Nagaland 0.6, there is a problem in the data. See, even if the percentage share of urban is less, the growth rate is quite high. That is why the relevance of understanding urbanization in Northeast. So it is quite high. India average is 17. All others are 27, 23. So this can happen only because two reasons. Either because of natural increase, that is birth minus death, or there is some degree of mobility, people coming, into this area, whatever it may be, that we don't know. The other interesting thing, why Northeast urbanization is different. The reason is different is, if you look into the size class of cities, most of the northeastern centers fall on the class 3, 4, 5. That means the urban centers are small and medium. Big cities, 1 lakh and above is very fast. If Guwahati is 9 lakhs, then you can imagine. But this is very important. It reflects a subsistence nature of the economy. The fact that small and medium urban areas are predominant reflects that the levels of urbanization is low, the economy is still agro-based, and therefore the tertiary and the secondary and tertiary has not improved, right? So therefore this is again, we need to understand the rate of urbanization, the growth rate and the types. So that is why here little bit of becomes very important, like in the context of our urban policy, both at the national level and the state level, we have a tendency to give, our whole urban discourse is actually driven by big cities. So this is a policy, this is a fallacy in terms of planning process at the national and at the state level, right? And of course the population concentration, but one thing is that just because there are large number of small centers doesn't mean that the population is not there in the big center. That is exactly when the primacy takes place. That is why Aizawl is growing. That is why Gangtok is growing. That is why Guwahati is growing. Maybe Imphal at the same time. Shillong is the same story. There are some centers which are administrative headquarters where the maximum concentration of the state's urban population is located. And what happens? That particular center is not able to cater to the increasing urban population, and that creates a problem. So this is one thing which I thought is important. Yeah, the slums are not a major issue. I was in a very interesting GNNURM thing. We came to Shillong, and the government of India has some criteria for identifying slums. But it was not appropriate to the state. And the state was saying that this is not the right criteria, you need to add other things. Otherwise, most of our places will not have any slums, because the criteria are so different. So that is one of the things, but looks like, I think the point here is, like with the urbanization, some degree of marginalization and dilapidated housing conditions are increasing, so that needs to be recognized. Yeah. So this is the latest classification. And this one I thought this is again, in terms of services. What is interesting is, in terms of services, actually many of the northeastern states except Assam and maybe Arunachal in something, they seem to be doing pretty well. Now, you will see this one, the latrine. It is much better than the state average. And that is where I think, besides maybe the state is playing role, I think the socio-cultural practices of the people also matters, right? Of course, bathrooms and all is there. So, but basically what I am trying to say is that I think in some parameters, the cities in the northeast are much better off than many other parts of India, right? And therein lies then maybe the opportunity. This was the city that was lay along that famous trade route, you know. But what I am basically trying to say is, so is the sprawl. Actually, the urban, you know, is only, you know, in this area, but many of this area also falls under rural area. It is very interesting. I was analyzing the data of Sikkim, you know, 81, 91, and all of a sudden I realized that, you know, the Gangtok area has come ho gaya hai, you know. And that was very revealing for me. How come, you know, growing city ka urban area, India mein sab jagah area बढ़ रहा है, उधर घट रहा है, you know. And then it was very interesting, you know, because, you know, many states like Sikkim has ruled that in rural areas you can't buy a property, but in urban area you can buy. So, if you increase the boundary of the urban areas, more people from outside, you know, has an incentive to buy. Therefore, the state decided maybe it is time to little bit readjust so that and deny, you know, because most of the what is known as the Benami transactions, you know, the transactions which happens in somebody else's name also happens in many of these areas. So, therefore, that was one of the things, but basically trying to show you the way the urbanization is taking place. Yeah, next. If you analyze, you know, the urban areas in northeast, what are the types of, you know, typology that you get? There are many towns which are something what is known as break-up bulk points between the hills and the plains, and they are the ones which naturally becomes center because one mode of transportation changes to a railway to road, right? And when that mode of transportation breaks, then it naturally becomes an incentive for urban areas to grow. Change in the transportation mode, transborder trade, many of the urban areas actually also develop along the transborder trade, and I think that is true for many states. Roads and river sites, and of course the railway sites, and roads and river sites mainly came after the colonial this thing, but the river side may have been existing before because that was the only internal navigation thing. Yes, most of the, you know, like urban areas in except for, you know, many of the northeast are basically administrative headquarters which have been formed after the reorganization of states, right. Of course, Guwahati is a different, or defense outposts like Shillong is a classic case, or maybe Darjeeling, or you know many other places, because, you know, many a times it is given that, you know, hill resorts were acquired by the British for, you know, recreational and health reason. But one of the also reason was strategic, because hill areas are strategically located, you know. So, naturally it becomes a defense outpost, right. So, therefore, defense was one. Plantation enclaves, you know, defense areas or hills, plateaus like administration. So, these are the different functional, you know, specialization, the functional typologies of urban areas that you see in northeast. Of course, you know, northeast, we also need to understand that, you know, northeast also has many small towns which are weekly markets. You know, again in our urbanization discourse we tend to ignore that, but, you know, if you happen to look at the British gazetteers, you know, I hope everybody knows about the gazetteer, you know, and that is where I say, you know, the Britishers were smart people. They not only co-opted institutions, they also use this weekly market to co-opt marginal spaces, right. So, they, in fact, you know, they document all the places in the 1940s when they wrote those gazetteers, all the documents which are the places where weekly markets are happen is documented, and that was basically because they wanted to promote them as a center for interacting between the colonial, you know, space and the indigenous space, right. And many of them later developed as small centers, towns and other things. So, those also we need to understand, but this is the type of settlements that you will see with the functional specialization. And related to this is the economic base. As I said, cities, you know, though I am saying that cities are beyond economics, but one of the most important aspect of cities to survive is economy. And if you analyze this, one of the most important thing which is missing is industries. See, if you look into the traditional, development discourse, what they say is when urbanization takes place, labor moves from primary to secondary to tertiary sector, right? And secondary is basically urban, right? But in the northeast, there is no secondary, and we know that because the industrial base, except for maybe Guwahati, little bit, cement and mining or all that, there is no industrial base in that area. Okay. So therefore, what I was trying to say was that, so that itself also challenges the notion of how urbanization is taking place in this part of the country. The traditional theory, of people moving from primary, secondary to tertiary was a Western experience. It need not necessarily be the experience of different parts of the world or different parts of the country. But that doesn't mean that urbanization is not taking place, right? If you again look into the economic history of India, many people say that urbanization ratio increased after British came. But if you look into the economic history of India, actually just before the British came, urbanization level in India was higher, because many of them were concentrated on small and medium towns, artisan-based economy, right? In fact, when the British came, because they destroyed the artisanal base of the city, the percentage urban declined, and later it picked up. So these are the type of economic activities you see, which is, I think, everybody can relate. So now let me go to a little bit of the planning thing. What are the challenges that you see here? One is many of the states, fall on the 6th schedule area. The land management issues and other thing, institutional issues become very, very different here. Okay, so therefore, one is that aspect we have to understand. The other thing is about borderland and security. The fact that this particular area, has sensitive because there are, mobility is restricted, country, there is no opening of trade routes and all that. So the borders create a problem. Now, what is interesting, the international, not only international borders, but even the borders of the state, right? That also becomes a constraint. The other issue is about infrastructure, traffic, water management issue. Now, we know that this is also the area where maximum water rain falls, but these are also the areas where water scarcity is there. So these are a contradiction in a way, and that also reflects how urbanization, urban areas have grown, because they are beyond the capacity of the natural resources to take care of. Then we have this issue of increasing population, we have already seen. The issue of diversity, density, migration, not only permanent and annual, but seasonal, right? So this is important, because diversity, of course, one of the discourse in urban planning and urban development is that a city is rated much better than any other city if it is multicultural, plural, because that is supposed to be the character of a city. But in India, sometimes we get a feeling that not only India, many other, that maybe the city like Shillong, Shillong is known for multicultural history, because it was British and it had rock bands, coming and playing. The first city in India which played that, and that guy is still there, But then we also have a different type of conflict playing out there, right? So therefore, this is one issue that I think the population issue, demographic issue have to be understood. Conflicts. There are different type of conflicts. Conflicts related to identity, assets, and conflict related to resources, The fact that, Arunachal, even Sikkim, you have dam in Tista, there are 32 dams in that particular stretch of land, right? And, of course, I think in Assam at least the movement is pretty strong and people are talking about it and all that, but it may not be so, but that is one thing. Another is within the city, there are problems of land, land which is to be built, and what is happening is because the cities have grown so fast, are growing so fast, all haphazard development, built forms, and what is very sad thing is that the vernacular architectural style is more or less lost here, that is one of the, and if you look into Assam's, 1934, I think there was an earthquake, Now, Assam had traditionally a architectural system which was bamboo and mud, it is still there, but in the rural areas. But if you go to urban areas, it is all concrete. So people are shifting, but the cost, and not only of the, in terms of monetary cost, but also cost in terms of environment. Because, if you build a house with, today we are talking about waste disposal, right? Suppose if you build a house with concrete and you have to dispose that waste, where will you dispose? That is a waste issue. It is not only plastic. Plastic is because it is immediate. But, these buildings also has life, they have a lifespan, right? So these are issues I think we need to understand. Sanitation, of course, there are many issues here. There are two things of sanitation. One, of course, that is another thing which is very important. The statistics shows that northeastern states, you see, is doing better off in terms of having a toilet. That is where our Swachh Bharat has problem. Just because you have a toilet doesn't mean that sanitation issue is addressed. You know what happens? Like, think of northeast. You have plains and you have the hills. And most of the places don't have sewage treatment facilities. So what happens is that in the hill areas, everybody may have a toilet, but where does it go? Either it is a septic tank, or it goes to what is known as the natural drains, like Jhora, that's springs. You see, that is the easiest point to dispose of the waste. The other thing in the plains is because the water table is high, like if you go to Guwahati and other places, the groundwater table is high. Now, suppose you build a septic tank and all that type of thing, the chances of groundwater getting polluted is much more higher, right? So just because we have many toilets doesn't mean that we are Swachh. I think there are larger environmental issues which you need to understand. That is where that I think the urban planning becomes much more challenging. How do you address these issues? Climate vulnerability and all, again, it is, I don't have to tell, because flooding is a common issue, and more the city develop haphazardly, more areas become vulnerable, right? And that is true in the hills. There is in planning what is known as the floor space, index. You are allowed to build, up to 2, 3, depending upon what the municipality or the planning authority is allowed, but most of the people build beyond that. So what is happening is that you are violating the norms, planning norms and regulation, and that creates a lot of problem, right? And again, because now land is monetized, therefore there is incentive for people to build, right? So this is also an example of a reflection of a, commodification of land. Now, because Guwahati is acting as a primate city, and it is a city at the center of the, northeastern thing, the demand for land is much more higher, right? So this is some of the issue. We have problem of weak governance, finance, the taxing system. I think we cannot get into the detail, but just to give you example, the fact that the land becomes an issue because the land was given to somebody else, the British took it on lease or whatever and brought some people. These are issues of governance. Finance certainly is how much tax you can raise, how much other things you can get, but at the end of the day, very, very weak capacity. One of the major important thing that we also noticed was in terms of capacity building. Many of the big consultancy firms are not willing to come to the northeast, and the municipal corporation or the planning authorities don't have the capacity to design the project in the way they want to. So therefore, that becomes a problem. So it is the question of capacities within the so when you are talking about urban challenges, it is not only about how to plan a city and other things, but also about designing a project, and that is one of the things which is missing. And today the government says that cities will mobilize loans from banks. Just imagine how come these particular cities with so weak finance and capacity will mobilize loans. They will anyway be excluded from the process of bidding and all that, right? So this is one thing. And of course, the issue of employment, unemployment and all these things are there. So, but that doesn't mean that the northeastern cities or urban areas don't have opportunities. I think just to get bogged down with problems may be an issue, but opportunities are there. How do you plan it out? Maybe, education or hospitality sector, tourism, potential border trade. I think that is what people are talking about. NASSCOM did a very interesting study when I think around 2000 late, in order to understand the skill levels of, in the hospitality sector all over India. And the northeastern youths were the first ranking, because in terms of, the skills they had in terms of communication and all that. So therefore, actually, if you think about properly, many of the demographic dividends in this particular place may also be good, but provided there is an opportunity, right. This is Gangtok, This was just before, I think, it became part of India, in the sense that, it was still a protectorate. Now you see that place. This is exactly what I am trying to say. This is not actually permitted as per the bylaws of the city, And this is again earthquake prone zone number 5. So this is how the, the build forms are changing. I think these are planning challenges. And you will see a very interesting pattern. I am sure this is also true for many other places. You can easily identify where the road is going, you see, because all the houses are built along the road. And of course, my assessment is, because the government of India is giving so much emphasis on corridor development, DMIC, the national highways, our urban future is going to be linear all along the roads. Because we are developing the high speed corridors, bus network, railway network pattern, that is what is happening. But even in the hills, in the mountain regions or in the northeastern, you can see the same pattern. Again, you see this, if you see the slope, one wonders how did they allow this to be built here. It's not supposed to be here. The other thing, this is again, what is interestingly happening is that in many of these places, I told you that in many of the northeastern states, the industrial base is missing. So what the state is doing is giving incentive for industries. And when you give incentives for industry, what do you give? You give land, you give many tax exemptions, and what is happening is, and where is the land? Land is only along the river. This is one of the factories which is just located along the Tista, Sikkim area. Now you can imagine, what is the environmental vulnerability of this place. One doesn't know how much employment that is being generated, because when the state says that we are attracting because it generates employment, but one wonders whether to that extent the employment is being generated. Next. See, this is the small town which has developed all along the confluence of this particular river, right. So this is exactly what I am trying to say, that these are urban challenges, which how do you address this is a major concern. This is about infrastructure. I think this is true for all hill towns and cities in India, There are so many pipelines, one doesn't know how is it possible. We are supposed to have some good engineering, civil engineering, infrastructure, institutes in the world, but how come? How come we are not able to solve this problem? Then we are talking about smart cities. I think smartness comes if you address the basic issues like this. I am also showing you this picture because this is just above a nala, where most of the solid waste are dumped. You know why they do like this? Because they don't have to dig the ground to put the nala, to the pipes. So it is easy for them. But when it gets flooded, there is every possibility the water gets mixed up with this pipe. So the public health is an issue, right? Planning is exactly supposed to address public health, but this is one of the simple example. But I have seen this in Aizawl, I have seen it in many other places, Shillong, everywhere this is the scene. Yeah, one thing I wanted to tell you was, I was talking to you about this, what is known as the primacy, that is a literature which is available, but it happened. But what I am trying to say is that why do, say for instance, in Sikkim, Gangtok only develops? Why do you think that in Mizoram only Aizawl develops? You will see the difference here. If you look into the amenities, you look at the state average and the urban average, it is always higher. So naturally, that means the amenities are not distributed regionally across different states or small towns. So everybody comes into this area because good schools are there, good facilities are there. So naturally, this tends to become an agglomeration. Maybe it is still small, but given the environmental vulnerability, it becomes a problem. The other important thing is about density. I am showing you this again because the density, one of the things is, see, every place or a region has a carrying capacity, right? Now, one of the best indicators to measure the carrying capacity of a land is density. How much land is being pressurized because of population? And you will see this. If you see Sikkim in 2001, in Darjeeling. So, the increasing density, but what is very interestingly happening is this, I am showing this in the hill areas, the densities are increasing and moving uphill, towards the base, from the base to the mountain top. So that again has major environmental challenges, right? Yeah, I wanted to show you this. This is what happens when the borders are created. Darjeeling and Sikkim, Gangtok. Darjeeling is one of the oldest municipal corporations in India. Started around 1860s. Before that, if you go into that municipal corporation building, before 1975, the Gangtok situation is much different. I was telling you about when the reorganization of the state takes, how the space, the character of the space changes because you have created different states, right? And this is one classic example. Now, by all standard, Gangtok is way ahead of Darjeeling. So what I'm basically trying to say is that, boundaries create problem, and also opportunities for other plans. And therefore, what happens? There is inequality. I was telling you that large number of people move from one particular place to the other place because more opportunities are available. And then what happens? Interesting, when people move from one part to the other part, again the same issue of conflict, right? You are coming to our place and taking our job, that conflict emerges. Of course, there are also exclusionary spaces in northeastern cities. You will see this everywhere. It may be based on colonial space, like, the ring roads or whatever it may be. Feudal monarchy, monastery, local versus based on ethnicities, barriers, and this is very important, our cities, of course, that is true for everybody, but so there are certain spaces which is historically created in northeastern cities also. Next, I think this is important because this we very frequently encounter, like say for instance, the rights of the indigenous versus the migrants, how do they, on the one hand we talk about citizenship, inclusiveness and all that, but certainly there are issues and conflicts because of the resources, competing resources. The issues of identity, local versus outsiders, or within that also there are multiple local identities, which often comes in conflict, Land, I think at the end of the day, land is the most important thing, and there are issues of domiciled and non-domiciled. Domiciled supposed to have the land, but non-domiciled are not supposed to have access to land. Okay, and then of course there are urban versus rural, which is basically I'm talking about the periphery. The other major issue is about the environmental conflict, which again is very important. I think in the context of Northeast, which I said because of the environmental sensitivity of that area. There are two types of issues which emerges here. One is conflict upstream, the city gets the water, right? It needs water. What does it do? It taps water from some other spring. When it taps water from that spring, the local villages are affected, right? That is the upstream conflict which is coming up. And there are downstream. There can be any other example. I'll show you the waste disposal. This is the one. This is a waste because the urban area, of course, even in plain area, this is becoming a problem. But what I'm trying to say is that the downstream conflict, because cities are all hill stations have, on the slope, they don't have land to dispose waste, and they come and bring it at some other place which is not their area. So this creates a conflict which is the downstream conflicts. So how do you resolve this is also a major issue. How do you approach this problem? I think, of course, it is not going to solve all the problems, but as a planner, I would see this problem can be viewed from two perspectives. One is what is known as urban or town-centric strategies, and in India, this is very well established. This is one thing which I want to mention. When you are talking about urban challenges and all, everywhere you will hear master plan, development plan. But what is not happening is the regional, right? So what I'm basically trying to emphasize is the cities don't develop in isolation. It has networks with other settlements, and it is dependent on resources beyond its boundary. Now, if you want to address these issues, you certainly need regional planning. Why I'm telling this is all other countries, especially the European countries like Germany or Japan or Korea, even Korea, France, Netherlands. What they do is our urban policy is very, myopic in the sense that we only focus on the urban because there is a problem, right? But basically urban problem can only be addressed if you start planning at the regional level. And why I am telling this? Actually, there is a constitutional mandate for that. You have heard about the 73rd and 74th Amendment Act. What does it say? It basically says the same thing. How do you integrate the urban and the regional plans? Right? And despite the constitutional mandate, we have not been able to do that. Act was passed sometimes in 93, 94, right? Today we are still talking about that, right? When GNNURM was implemented, they made it mandatory that unless and until you implement the 74th Amendment Act, you will not have access to resources from the center. Gandhinagar, Gujarat Gandhinagar is a classic case. After it was planned for nearly 30 years, it didn't have a local body. It was a notified area. And interestingly, few years back, I think 2011, 12, they had a municipal corporation because of the GNUR. Even Gurgaon didn't have a municipal corporation. So unless you have a corporation which is representing the people, how do you think that the cities will be managed? Notified areas is like cantonment areas, So therefore, there are two strategies one can follow, which I believe in, and I believe that the regional strategies are the weakest in India, except the National Capital Region Plan of Delhi and Goa, which has some, mandatory statutory plan. No other place has, though people are talking about this. So as far as urban is concerned, you can have lot of, focus on the development control regulations, the land use planning, infrastructure, incremental beautification, heritage, and all that. One can address these issues, right? This was an area which was not like this before. I think this is what I call it as an incremental beautification approach. Okay, now it has become a very vibrant space, and in urban planning, of course, space is very important. Public spaces, people need to use it, and so this space was created. Though there was some resistance later on, people did accept it, and now it is quite functional. I think that was quite a successful, because in urban planning, urban planning is very, very car and motor vehicle oriented. You will never see a plan which is pedestrian oriented. You see, now of course everybody is talking about how do you pedestrianize, and I think this is one classic example. In a small way, it has done. Why I am showing you this is, I think it has relevance in the northeastern context, not of course the plains. This is again the pedestrianization has taken place. Again, it doesn't solve all the problem, but it does help in terms of mobilities. Of course, this is basically not about plan but about management. See, we need to differentiate between a plan and a management. You can plan a traffic, but you can also manage a traffic. You see, this is a classic example of one-way traffic in the same space. So what one is talking about is if you manage space well, maybe you can accommodate more. So the space is utilized properly. This is Simla. I found it. I'm just giving example because Simla was interesting because they could use the lift and all that. So yeah, this I want to show you this Brazil. Because I am talking about urban and Brazil, there are very interesting experiments going on in the favelas, in the slums. Very fond of football, and that is true in the favelas also. So what has happened is there is a movement going on by some architects and planners. What are they doing is within that limited favela space, they are trying to create some spaces which the people can use it. Because what they are saying is if people don't have space to use, that is where the gangs and the drug wars and all this thing is taking place. So they have taken a conscious decision to generate or create public or open spaces where kids, especially young people, can move around. And this is one example. Right in the middle, a small space, they have designed a small football pitch. You see, as I said, that it is not only important to plan for the city, but we have to plan it at the regional context. And as I said, that is missing. One of the things, what we can do, what is possibility is that, because cities are embedded in the natural context, watershed becomes a very important unit of planning, and especially I am telling this in the context of northeastern hill states and others, watershed as a planning boundary is very, very critical, because watershed is considered to be geohydrologically homogeneous unit. So if you organize your resource management and planning within that particular context by identifying watershed and then using it, I think that becomes very, very important. So I think, all this can be done at the regional level, integrating the markets and all that type of thing. And regionalization is actually a practice which is followed everywhere, okay, but we don't do it consciously. When it comes to implementation, which is not, and this is one of the most scientific way of planning, the physical spaces, the environmental spaces. Now, as you move from, I'm just giving example of Tista, it is a macro basin, then you can have a meso basin depending upon the trajectories, and within that you have micro. And this particular area can be further subdivided based on where the urban is located, and we can plan it out. So, just example from Sikkim, the whole of area is divided into different watersheds, right. Now, that is what I was saying. So, if you know where the urban areas are located, what are the geohydrological potential of these particular places, I think one can really integrate the urban, in the regional context, right. So, this is one of the things I think we need to follow. Because I come from an urban planning tradition, I see it as an urban planning issues coming up, because Northeast is going to urbanize, it is going to be a major issue, and I think unless we develop a proper strategy, for the cities in this area, I think that is going to be a major issue in the future. Some of the issues which I see it as like this: one, planning for the city, but planning also at the regional level. The city has to be indebted in the region. If you don't do this, this is the physical side of it. But there are other issues which is important. One is the governance issues, right? How do you integrate the contradictory acts? On the one hand, you have the 6th Schedule Act, okay, and there are many other parastatal agencies, how will it match? So I think these are some of the challenges which I think the cities in Northeast will have to face in the future, okay. One of the challenges which I deliberately not discuss is because I have asked you to read something. So, that is I think the most critical challenge. And one of the criticism of planning, though I am also a planner, one of the weakness of the planning is planning so far has not found a way out to integrate the social and political conflicts in the plan making process. Because planning as a discipline is very, very seen as a technocratic discipline. So, you create land use, you think things get resolved, but it doesn't, right. I have no answer, that is why I thought I will give it to you to read and tell us something what we can do. Okay, I am done. Thank you.